Back when I appeared on Triggernometry in March of 2024, I told Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster that there will be no Gen Z moderates. They're vanishingly rare and hard to find. Instead, with Zoomers, you have to pick your preferred flavour of revolution, whether it's woke communism or right-wing reactionary traditionalist revival. And the latter category is mainly spearheaded by young, particularly white Christian men, because they are, of course, the public enemy number one of the ruling woke hegemony. Now, at the last American election in 2024, the gender divide did not manifest as broadly as was feared, because it turns out there are lots of very sensible, good-looking, intelligent young women who don't hate men and who don't make their sole political issue the ability to abort a child up until birth, and so the gender divide is not as big as the New York Times and Kamala Harris had prophesized and hoped. However, the divide between boomers and zoomers on what is considered politically moderate or within the acceptable parameters of established political doctrines, basically the different flavors of liberalism that fought against Soviet communism during the Cold War and was acceptable following the Nazi, fascist, and communist atrocities of the Second World War, that paradigm is waning. The dead hand is being lifted from the consciousnesses of the latest generation, who are the furthest from the fading light of the 20th century. And I based my predictions at the time on this 2022 polling by Onward. It's from a study called The Kids Aren't All Right, the 4 factors driving a dangerous detachment from democracy. Now, they say dangerous. I don't think that's the case, because there's some embellishment in here that Gen Z just want a dictator. Now, bear in mind, we didn't get an ethnic breakdown for a lot of this data, so how much of the increasingly diverse Gen Z being polled are Muslims and want a caliphate? Not determined. However, when they say dictator, what they really mean, in the polling here, in the question, is having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections. That doesn't make him a dictator in the 20th century sense. That could make him an emergency appointed Caesar figure, per the Roman Republic, who in times of great crisis, like Cincinnatus, puts down his plough and takes up an office of state, and then, or like George Washington, relinquishes that power when the crisis has been averted. And I think, given now we've got more in common focus group sessions where, Gary, sales manager from Bournemouth, is saying we need a coup d'etat, we need a Cromwell to get in there and sort these politicians out and make them accountable to the people. What I think is driving this attraction towards military intervention, saying putting the army in charge, or a kind of authoritative Caesar figure coming to power, is a frustration with the political processes, a recognition that during COVID, the government can control all of the economy and private life by convening a press conference and just declaring it so, meaning that if the government fails to act, that is a decision by the government not to act, rather than some principled constraint or function of the system putting limits on the scope and ability of their powers. And also, it is seeing that actually voting doesn't do very much, right? It is seeing that time and time again, the British electorate have expressed their desire to see mass immigration prevented, the mass demographic experiment inflicted upon us that we voted against in every single election and referendum since 1974 reversed, that foreign criminals should be sent home. Every time we express this desire in the Brexit referendum or successive general elections, we're just ignored, we're gaslit, and we're told we're doing something about it while the numbers continue to increase and quality of life gets worse. And so, it's not necessarily that people hate voting. It's not necessarily that people hate a democratic system. It is instead the kind of Aristotelian recognition that the only thing dividing any given system between democracy and mob rule, between aristocracy and oligarchy, between monarchy or strong men and tyranny, is the virtue of the leaders. And our leaders are morally depraved, treacherous, cowardly, and quite stupid. And so we'd much rather someone capable step in and clean this mess up. And this is a pattern which is repeated across the political divides among Zoomers. So this is the poll that was conducted at the start of this year as part of a Channel 4 program, and the Independents say more than half of Gen Z want the UK to become a dictatorship, but yet again, the question was, the UK would be a better place if the army was in charge, or a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections was in charge. That doesn't mean a dictator. I mean, let's say that this person got in, they cleaned up the mess, and they ran for election again. do we think that they would be elected? Like Nayib Bukele, for example, who enjoys a 90% approval rating and got over 85% of the vote at the last election because he went from El Salvador being a place controlled entirely by demonic MS-13 gangs to incarcerating all the criminals and allowing his population, no matter how poor and developing they may remain, to live in relative peace and enjoy a greater level of prosperity than before Bukele took power. Of course, people would prefer a Bukele figure to Keir Starmer being the civil service in a badly fitting suit, administering over the anarcho-tyranny which favours foreign criminals over tax-paying, law-abiding British nationals that we are suffering from now. And so you get to this new polling by the Adam Smith Institute, as tweeted out by Emma Schubart here, and she does some very good threads, so you should go and follow her. She has criminally few followers on Twitter at the moment, only 500, but she says, in the latest ASI polling, a third of Brits, 18 to 30, so mainly Zoomers, say they prefer an authoritarian system if it meant faster decisions. Again, people don't want, as she points out, a dictator, necessarily. They just want someone who has executive authority, a sovereign, to come in, take charge, make decisions, and actually listen to what the people want. Because, generally speaking, the British public do have a modicum of common sense. I mean, because of Britain's unique family structure, its Christian ethos, religion that was a lot more explicit in the past, but still underwrites all of our common law traditions and customs, because of the 1,000 years of history and habit, common sense does actually reside in a large portion of the British public. They want migration reduced, they want a general sense of fairness, they want criminals punished, they're in favour of the death penalty for paedophiles, rapists, terrorists, and murderers. They would like taxes to be substantively lower. They still think that there's a place for a welfare state, but I think that they could probably be convinced that charitable enterprises and institutions, the kinds that were run by philanthropists in Victorian Britain at the kind of zenith of our civilization, could take over those roles and provide based on relationships between people, which means that you have to extend to other people moral consideration rather than just going to the state, no matter what your lifestyle choices are I deserve a human right to healthcare and benefits. That's not very fair, is it? But the British public generally agree with all of those sentiments. They're quite sensible. And so what they want is not necessarily a dictator. They want someone without the liberal trappings that prevent them from exercising power, and instead who defer to antiquated and punitive laws that were put in place for a wholly different set of political conditions after the Second World War, which causes us to continually admit foreign criminals who exploit our generous asylum system and demand that the police give them special protections because they are from minority characteristic backgrounds. The British public don't like that very much. They want someone with executive authority to come in, scrap those laws, deport those criminals, and make Britain a peaceful and prosperous place, which it was back before 1945. And so if you look at a lot of the polling, it says here that a majority of them are still democratic, but only a slim majority, about 20% are indifferent or don't know, and a third of them prefer authoritarianism. So if you add the indifferent and don't know, it means that the majority of young people are not ideologically wedded to democracy as presented to them, mainly because democracy is a total sham. Our establishment have, again, inflicted mass migration on us. They have entered numerous wars of regime change without any popular mandate from the public. One of the largest protests in Britain, for example, was in 2003 when millions turned out on the streets to protest against the Iraq War, and we got involved in Libya and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Ukraine anyway. So our government just do not respect the mandate of the people, and instead they would rather someone who has more power but is more attentive to our concerns. It's why England has always been happy with a king, despite the fact that under liberal ideologies, they would say, this person is not elected, they are not democratically accountable, therefore their rule is illegitimate. No, the legitimacy rests in how attentive they are to the needs of their subjects and their countrymen, rather than whether or not they are voted in and hypothetically accountable, even if, while in office, they betray you anyway. And you get Hobson's choice between which party will betray you the next time it comes to vote them in or out. And so Emma does point this out, that among young voters, only 34% of Labour, 39% of Conservative, but 50% of Reform voters say they prefer an authoritarian system. And what this means is they want a system disruptor. This is what Reform codes as, even if they're currently not. right? They code as a hand grenade, a Molotov cocktail, as Michael Moore once said of Donald Trump, thrown at an inattentive establishment. They want someone to get in there and mess the system up because the system does not serve them, and it's almost gleeful in the horrors that it inflicts upon us. So they would quite like Nigel Farage and Reform to be that strong man, to be that disruptor. Whether or not they live up to their potential, the mandate afforded to them by the electorate, is a different question. But those with the least to benefit from a system have the least to lose by breaking that system apart. And when the system is illegitimate, unjust, and unsustainable, then you do need a system disruptor. And that's why they're saying, we would quite want that. And this is why you're getting this argument on BBC Newsnight, a kind of conversation that was unthinkable to platform quite some time ago. Poppy Coburn, who used to work for New Culture Forum, but is now at the Telegraph, she's arguing with Baroness Chakrabarti, who is a human rights lawyer. I think she's Bangladeshi ethnically, so she could actually get Bangladeshi citizenship if she wanted. But we used to work for the Blair government. She argues with Poppy Coburn over whether or not we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights, abolish the Human Rights Act, and leave the UN Refugee Convention in order to deport all of these foreign criminals that keep coming over, either overstaying their visas or smuggling themselves aboard small boats and lorries from Calais to break into Britain and be housed at our expense. And Chakrabarti, being wedded to the post-war Blairite paradigm, says it's absolutely unthinkable that we would leave these laws even if they are not functioning for the British people. And that is because she believes in a universal standard human for whom an all-encompassing, rationally divined political system can be made to be fit for governing all people. And this is the project of international institutions like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the European Union. These post-democratic institutions are actually appointing themselves to be the true arbiters of democracy, because by presuming everyone to be exactly the same underneath, that all geographic, cultural, and economic differences are easily remedied by the intervention by a liberal state, they are instead acting on behalf of everyone's true equal self-interest, and so it's properly democratic, because if you were allowed to vote for this, you would all vote for it if you didn't have the false consciousness of inequality, because deep down we're all blank slates, we all believe the same thing, and so we should all want the same type of government. And instead, Gen Z, having grown up in a very diverse society, having never known a high-trust, homogenous and prosperous Britain from before Tony Blair, and to a large extent Margaret Thatcher and all of her conservative successors ruined it, we have nothing to lose by noticing differences and just saying, actually no, these laws don't work, this paradigm has exhausted itself, its contradictions are being made manifest in the daily injustices that we, the British public, have to suffer every day, and so we can just scrap it and replace it with something else. And it is totally unthinkable for the globalist drones like Chakrabarti, or the One Nation Conservatives, or Keir Starmer, to envision a future where there aren't laws that are ostensibly independent, governing all men, because every single human being is equal and the same. Instead, we are happy to act in the national interest, and we are happy to step outside the bounds of liberal international law in order to get things done. And as much as they might scream and whine and say, that's not a country I'd feel very comfortable about living in, well, one, you can move. Two, I think just based on demographics, you're going to get a Zoomer revolution anyway, whether you like it or not.